In the heart of New York City, where the relentless hum of activity never ceases, Wyatt had carved out a semblance of peace for himself. At 30, he was a well-regarded software developer for a mid-sized tech company, living a life that, to anyone passing by, would seem enviably stable. His apartment, nestled on the 12th floor of a sleek Manhattan building, offered a breathtaking view of the city that never sleeps, a constant reminder of his achievements and aspirations. Yet, beneath the surface of his orderly existence, Wyatt harbored a quiet struggle that few could guess. Since childhood, he had been prone to anxiety, a condition he managed with a mix of stoicism and subtle routine. It wasn't something he often spoke about. In a city brimming with aspiring individuals, vulnerabilities were closely guarded. On a particularly ordinary Thursday, as the sun dipped below the horizon painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, Wyatt's life took an unsuspected turn. It was an evening like any other, with him unwinding after a long day's work, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across his thoughtful face. The sudden ring of his phone shattered the calm. The number flashing on the screen was unlisted, an anomaly that piqued his curiosity despite his better judgment. Answering the call, he was greeted not by a voice he recognized, but by a chillingly calm tone that conveyed a stark, unnerving message. Wyatt, listen carefully. Not everyone around you is who they seem to be. Before he could muster a response, the line went dead, plunging his mind into a whirlpool of doubt and fear. Little did he know, this was merely the beginning of an ordeal that would test the very fabric of his reality. Late one restless night, as the city sounds melded into a distant murmur, Wyatt found himself unable to sleep. The digital numbers on his bedside clock blinked 2:03 a.m. in a relentless, luminous loop. It was during these small, silent hours that his apartment felt most isolated from the kinetic energy of Manhattan below. Just as he decided to abandon his attempts at sleep and perhaps seek solace in a book, his phone erupted with a sharp ring that sliced through the stillness of the night. He reached out with a tentative hand to silence the alarming sound, his heart rate accelerating with each tone. The screen displayed an unlisted number, a string of digits that offered no clues, but suggested urgency or danger. With a mixture of curiosity and apprehension tightening in his chest, Wyatt answered the call. His hello was met with a brief pause, the kind that stretches just enough to make the silence itself seem heavy and foreboding. Then, a voice, unfamiliar and eerily compassed, pierced through the quiet. Wyatt, do not trust what you see, it said in a hushed, urgent whisper. They are closer than you think, and they are not what they appear to be. The words hung in the air like a toxic mist, impossible to grasp yet undeniably present. As suddenly as it had begun, the call ended, leaving behind a void filled with echoing words and escalating dread. Wyatt sat frozen, the phone still pressed against his ear, as the reality of the warning began to seep into his bones. This mysterious message, delivered from an unknown source, threatened to unravel the fragile threads of his perceived reality. In the chilling aftermath of the unexpected call, Wyatt remained motionless, his thoughts whirling with the enigmatic warning he had just received. The cryptic nature of the message left him grappling with its implications. The voice, devoid of emotion yet imbued with an urgency that could not be ignored, had delivered a simple yet profound warning. Not everyone around you is who they seem to be. This statement echoed in Wyatt's mind, its resonance amplifying the stillness of the early morning. It was a declaration that seemed absurd on the surface, yet the seriousness with which it was delivered forced him to consider its potential truth. As he pondered the possibility that people in his life might not be what they appeared, a seed of doubt was planted. This seed, watered by the eerie atmosphere of the late-night call, began to sprout into a formidable tree of suspicion and paranoia. The line went dead with a stark finality that left a palpable silence in its wake. Wyatt, still clutching the phone, felt a rush of confusion wash over him. The abruptness of the disconnection mirrored the suddenness with which the voice had intruded upon his night. One moment, the air was thick with ominous warnings. The next, he was thrust back into the silent darkness of his bedroom, the normalcy of which now seemed superficial. He was shaken, his mind racing with the potential implications of the cryptic admonitions he had just heard. Despite the visceral reaction to the voice's chilling directive, a part of him remained staunchly skeptical. Questions surged in his mind, vying for dominance over the unsettling feelings the call evoked. Who would do this, and why? Was this merely a cruel prank designed to exploit his late-night vulnerability, or was there some truth to the dire warnings? Wyatt's skepticism battled with the unease that gripped him, creating a tumult of emotion that refused to settle. As he lay back down, trying to reclaim the calm before the call, he knew sleep would now be even more elusive. The seed of doubt had already been sown, growing roots that would inevitably spread through the fabric of his daily existence. The morning after the call, as sunlight seeped through the gaps in his curtains, Wyatt tried to dismiss the entire incident as a distasteful joke. Someone, he reasoned, had probably dialed the wrong number or perhaps targeted him for some misguided amusement. As he prepared for the day, he attempted to brush off the lingering unease that clung to him like a stubborn shadow. However, as he ventured into his daily routines, subtle discrepancies in the behavior of those around him began to gnaw at his resolve. It started with the barista at his usual coffee shop, who handed him his coffee with a hand that trembled ever so slightly, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as it normally did. Then, on the subway, he caught a fellow commuter staring at him with an intensity that seemed loaded with unspoken words or warnings. These instances might have gone unnoticed on any other day, but now, tainted by the residue of last night's call, they seemed fraught with significance. Each awkward pause in conversation, each hurried glance thrown his way, fed into the burgeoning suspicion that had taken root in his mind. Despite his initial dismissal, Wyatt found himself increasingly alert to these small anomalies, the ordinariness of his world now tainted with a veneer of strangeness that was hard to ignore. Trying to find some grounding amidst his growing unease, Wyatt turned to the two people he trusted most. Mia, his girlfriend, and Tom, his best friend. Over dinner, he casually mentioned the bizarre phone calls, watching their reactions closely. Both Mia and Tom listened with a concern that seemed genuine, quickly brushing off the idea as a prank, urging him not to let it bother him. Yet, even their reassurances came across as slightly strained. Mia, normally so compassed, fidgeted with her napkin more than usual, her laughter a bit too sharp at times. Tom, who was typically the epitome of calm, had a tightness around his eyes that didn't quite dissipate throughout the conversation. Their words were meant to soothe, but their body language betrayed a subtle disconnect. This dissonance only deepened Wyatt's suspicions, adding layers to his already conflicted feelings. The more they tried to convince him of the absurdity of the situation, the more he noticed these small but peculiar shifts in their demeanor. It was as if the very act of trying to dismiss his fears somehow made them more real, more palpable. Their slight oddities, perhaps innocent in themselves, now loomed larger in Wyatt's perception, further blurring the line between paranoia and reality. As the evening wore on and the city's noises faded into a background hum, Wyatt found himself alone with his thoughts, the echoes of his friend's reassurances dwindling in his mind. He replayed the phone call in his head, each word sharpening the edges of his anxiety. The voice's warning, "They are closer than you think, and they are not what they appear to be," resonated with a menacing clarity against the canvas of the night. With each recollection, his interactions throughout the day took on new ominous meanings. The unusual tremble of the barista's hand, the intense stare of the subway commuter, even Mia's fidgeting and Tom's unusually tense expressions, all these snapshots coalesced into a mosaic of suspicion. Every laugh that didn't quite sound right, every glance that lingered too long, seemed to validate the mysterious caller's words. This cascade of memories and observations fed into Wyatt's growing paranoia. The walls of his apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt confining, as if they were closing in on him with their secrets. The night stretched on, each tick of the clock, a reminder of his isolation in a city full of hidden faces and veiled intentions. As sleep eluded him, the line between irrational fear and justified caution began to blur, leaving him adrift in a sea of doubt. In the small hours of another sleepless night, Wyatt's phone shattered the silence once again. His heart lurched as he saw another call from an unlisted number glowing ominously on the screen. With a hand that hesitated, he answered, the familiar dread settling heavily on his shoulders. The same disembodied voice, now even more urgent than before, cut straight to the chase. "Wyatt, you are in real danger," it hissed through the phone, the words sharp and clear. "Trust is a luxury you can no longer afford indiscriminately." The voice warned him with a seriousness that chilled his blood, insisting that the unseen threats woven into his daily life were closer and more real than he could imagine. The second call, laden with dire warnings, left Wyatt with a heavier. During the tense moments of the second call, the voice provided Wyatt with unsettling specifics. "Remember the meeting with your team yesterday?" It began, its tone clinical yet laced with an undercurrent of urgency. "Did you notice how your colleague, Janet, avoided your questions? And last week at the grocery store, the clerk who was overly friendly watched these signs." Each example struck a chord with Wyatt, bringing back a rush of seemingly insignificant moments that had felt just slightly abnormal at the time. The voice meticulously pointed out these irregularities, turning Wyatt's fleeting doubts into concrete suspicions. It seemed as if someone was watching his every move, noting every anomaly, no matter how minor, and feeding them back to him through these cryptic calls. With every instance cited by the caller, Wyatt's sense of reality began to warp. The world around him, once familiar and benign, now seemed like a carefully staged facade with him unwittingly at the center of some obscure or twisted play. This relentless detailing of events magnified his paranoia, pushing him further into a state of heightened alertness and distrust. As the days slipped into one another, Wyatt found himself withdrawing from the world he once navigated with ease. His interactions became fewer and more perfunctory, his outings reduced to necessities. The vibrant social life he once enjoyed now felt like a minefield, each conversation a potential trap. He spent long hours by the window of his apartment, his eyes scanning the faces of passers-by, trying to detect any hint of the abnormalities the mysterious voice had warned him about. In cafes, he would sit in the farthest corner, his back against the wall, observing the patrons and staff with a newfound scrutiny. Each smile, each exchange seemed to him a performance, every gesture potentially loaded with hidden meaning. His friends noticed the change. Calls and texts from Mia and Tom piled up, filled with concern and confusion, but Wyatt responded with vague assurances, never fully revealing the extent of his distress. He felt compelled to protect himself by keeping his own counsel, trusting no one fully, always alert to the possibility that the voice on the phone had been right all along. This self-imposed isolation became both his refuge and his prison, as he struggled to maintain a semblance of normalcy, while gripped by the fear of unseen dangers lurking all around him. Wyatt's escalating sense of distrust inevitably began to permeate every facet of his life, most notably at work and within his personal relationships. At the office, his usual collaborative and engaging nature took a backseat to a more reserved and distracted demeanor. He missed deadlines, his presentations lacked their usual polish, and he often appeared lost in thought during team meetings, unresponsive to the dynamic brainstorming sessions that had once energized him. Colleagues started whispering, their curiosity piqued by his sudden change. They exchanged concerned glances, wondering what had dimmed the spark of their once enthusiastic peer. His manager pulled him aside, offering support and querying if everything was alright at home, but Wyatt just nodded noncommittally, unwilling to divulge the true nature of his distress. Similarly, his relationship with Mia began to fray at the edges. She felt increasingly shut out, her attempts to reach him met with barriers he constructed from his fears and suspicions. Conversations that once flowed easily now stumbled and halted on his growing reticence and her frustration. Each unanswered question, each avoided eye contact from Wyatt added layers of tension that neither of them knew how to navigate. Tom, ever the steadfast friend, tried to bridge the growing gap, but even his patience was tested, as Wyatt's suspicions occasionally veered into accusations. The trio, once inseparable, found their bonds tested as Wyatt's internal battle spilled over, affecting those he loved most. The more he tried to protect himself from potential threats, the more he alienated the very people who were his anchors. One particularly tense evening, the strain of Wyatt's suspicions reached a breaking point. He and Tom had arranged to meet at a local bar, a spot they had frequented during happier times. The familiar setting, however, did little to ease the palpable tension that now defined Wyatt's interactions. As they sat across from each other, the clink of glasses and the low hum of conversation around them, Wyatt's gaze was piercing, his mind replaying every recent interaction, every half-answered question that had fed his doubts. The air between them thickened as Wyatt finally voiced the suspicions that had been gnawing at him. "You've been different, Tom." Distant and evasive. "What are you not telling me?" he demanded, his voice low but fraught with accusation. Tom, taken aback by the sudden confrontation, responded with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "What are you talking about, Wyatt? You're the one who's been off lately. You think I haven't noticed? But this accusing me of lying. Where is this coming from?" The exchange escalated quickly, voices rising over the ambient noise, as each man let his hurt and confusion fuel their words. Tom vehemently denied any deceit, his statements punctuated by gestures of exasperation and disbelief, while Wyatt, driven by his swirling paranoia, pushed harder, certain of betrayal. The argument reached its peak, leaving their friendship teetering on the edge of a precipice, both men too embroiled in their emotions to see a way back to understanding. As they parted ways that night, the cold air felt sharper, each step echoing the harsh words that had passed between them. As days blurred into nights, Wyatt found himself increasingly ensnared in a web of his own unsettling thoughts. Each waking hour was consumed by a torrent of doubts and fears, the boundaries between reality and delusion becoming ever more indistinct. His once analytical mind, trained to solve complex problems, now turned its scrutiny upon the shadows of his own perceptions, questioning the authenticity of every interaction and the truth behind every face he encountered. Sleep eluded him, and when it did come, it was fitful and haunted by dreams where indistinguishable figures whispered incoherent warnings. He would wake up disoriented, sweating, the remnants of nightmares clinging to him as he tried to shake off the fog of sleep. The isolation he had imposed on himself only deepened the chasm between his internal world and the external reality, making it harder for him to anchor himself to anything solid or reliable. His thoughts often spiraled uncontrollably, leading him to draw connections where there might be none, seeing patterns in the mundane that seemed to only confirm his worst fears. The constant tension caused headaches that throbbed mercilessly, clouding his vision and making days at the office nearly unbearable. Wyatt felt as if he was walking through a haze, every sound amplified, every glance towards him loaded with unspecified meaning. This relentless mental torment took a visible toll on him. His eyes, once sharp and clear, now often appeared red-rimmed and haunted. His movements became jittery, his conversations fragmented, as he grappled internally to determine what was real and what was the product of his unraveling mind. The struggle to maintain a grip on reality was exhausting, leaving him hollow and increasingly desperate for some semblance of normalcy that seemed just out of reach. Driven by a mix of desperation and a dwindling grasp on his own sanity, Wyatt resolved to take proactive steps to uncover the source of the unsettling phone calls that had tipped his world into chaos. This decision sparked a faint glimmer of purpose in him, a thread to follow out of the mental maze he felt trapped in. He started with the basics, poring over his phone records, scrutinizing each call for any clue that might have gone unnoticed. Finding nothing, he moved on to more technical means. Using software available through his work as a developer, he attempted to trace the calls back to their origin. Each unsuccessful attempt only deepened his resolve rather than discouraging him. Realizing he needed more advanced tools, Wyatt reached out to a contact from his past who specialized in digital security. They met in a nondescript cafe, where Wyatt explained his plight under the guise of working on a personal project. His contact was skeptical but agreed to help, intrigued by the challenge. Together, they set up more sophisticated tracking measures, hoping to catch the caller off guard. Wyatt knew this might be his only chance to gain some leverage, to pull back the curtain on whoever was manipulating his reality from the shadows. This pursuit consumed him, every fiber of his being focused on uncovering the truth behind the mysterious warnings that had so drastically altered his perception of the world. Wyatt's relentless pursuit of the truth eventually led him to a less frequented part of New York City. It was late at night when he arrived, the streets dimly lit and mostly deserted, lined with buildings that bore the marks of neglect, peeling paint, boarded up windows, and the occasional graffiti that seemed to whisper stories of better days. This part of the city felt like a forgotten chapter, starkly contrasting with the bustling, polished neighborhoods he was accustomed to. As he walked the airy, quiet streets, his footsteps echoed off the old concrete, each sound sharp in the cool night air. With a deep breath, Wyatt steeled himself and stepped forward, determined to confront whatever or whoever awaited him inside, hoping that this foray into the shadows would shed light on the dark corners of his ordeal. As Wyatt approached the grim facade of the building, a sudden movement in the periphery of his vision caught his attention. He turned sharply to see a figure emerging from the shadows of the alley beside the building. The figure was tall and slender, cloaked in a dark, hooded jacket that obscured most of their features. A chill ran down Wyatt's spine as he realized that this person had been watching him as he approached. The figure stood still for a moment, just at the edge of the light cast by a flickering street lamp. The minimal illumination caught glimpses of their eyes, which seemed to fixate on Wyatt with an intensity that was both unsettling and magnetic. Wyatt's initial instinct was to retreat, but the desperate need for answers overpowered his fear. "Who are you?" Wyatt called out, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. The figure didn't respond immediately, maintaining their distance and silence, adding to the surreal quality of the moment. After what felt like an eternity, the figure took a step forward, the light revealing more of their face, marked by a grave expression that suggested a deep familiarity with the dark. This mysterious encounter, shrouded in the stillness of the neglected street, felt like the crossing of thresholds from the known to the unknown, from relentless pursuit to a confrontation with whatever truth lay hidden in the shadows. Wyatt's senses sharpened, ready for whatever revelations the shadowy figure might bring. Standing face to face with the enigmatic figure, the dim streetlight casting long shadows around them, Wyatt's resolve hardened. The mysteriousness of the situation, the culmination of his fears and doubts, propelled him forward. He stepped closer, his voice firm and demanding as he addressed the figure directly. "Why have you been calling me? What do you want from me?" Wyatt's question sliced through the night air with urgency. The intensity in his eyes mirrored the desperation in his voice, seeking clarity in this web of uncertainty he'd been entangled in. The figure paused, their gaze unflinching as they met Wyatt's stare. The moment hung suspended, charged with a weight of unanswered questions and unspoken truths. The street around them seemed to quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath for the figure's reply. Wyatt's hands clenched at his sides, ready for any response, his mind racing with possible scenarios. Could this person be the source of his torment, or perhaps another victim? The possibilities churned in his mind, but above all, he needed to hear the truth from the lips of this mysterious watcher. The tension between them stretched thin as the figure finally lowered their hood, revealing a face that Wyatt recognized, one that he hadn't seen in years. It was Daniel, a friend from his college days, whose sharp intellect had once been the center of many deep discussions and late-night study sessions. However, the person standing before him now bore the marks of profound changes, not just in appearance, but in the uneasy aura that surrounded him. Daniel. Wyatt's voice was tinged with disbelief and concern. The familiarity of the face brought back a flood of memories, contrasting sharply with the present grim reality. Daniel's eyes, once lively and curious, now seemed clouded with a mix of recognition and caution. "Wyatt, you have to listen to me," he began, his voice low and urgent. "It's all connected. They've been watching, manipulating things behind the scenes." His words tumbled out in a rush, his demeanor suggesting a mind beleaguered by deep-seated fears and convictions. As he spoke, Daniel revealed how after college, he had spiraled into a world of conspiracy theories and psychological struggles, his life becoming a labyrinth of connections and suspicions that he believed led back to a sinister, unseen network. His intense gaze and the earnestness in his voice conveyed the depth of his belief in this dark narrative he had woven around both their lives. Wyatt listened, his initial shock giving way to a complex mix of sympathy and apprehension. Here was his old friend, profoundly altered by psychological distress, standing as the unexpected link to the mysterious calls that had so disrupted his life. As Daniel continued to unveil his tangled web of theories and perceived connections, Wyatt found himself at a crossroads of perception and reality. Each word from Daniel added layers to an already complex narrative, one that painted a world full of shadows and deceit, a narrative deeply at odds with the logical, evidence-based mindset that Wyatt had always relied upon. The stark, unsettling possibility that Daniel might be speaking some truth wrestled with Wyatt's rational instincts to dismiss it all as the ramblings of a troubled mind. Daniel's earnestness, the detailed account of his observations and experiences, were compelling, yet the rational part of Wyatt's brain screamed that it was paranoia, a distorted view of reality born from psychological distress. Wyatt's emotions churned with sympathy for his friend's apparent descent into madness, mixed with a haunting doubt that nibbled at his certainty. The decision to either trust this revived connection or to protect himself from a potentially delusional conspiracy was a tormenting dilemma. This internal battle strained him, pulling at the seams of his compassed analytical persona, leaving him feeling vulnerable and unsure in a way that he had never experienced before. Caught in the tumult of conflicting realities, Wyatt stood at a pivotal juncture. Daniel's intense conviction and the elaborate details of his conspiracy theory gnawed at him, presenting a narrative that was hard to completely ignore. On one hand, the fabric of the theory seemed woven with threads of plausible observations, pulling at Wyatt's sense of loyalty and the remnants of their past friendship. It urged him to consider the unthinkable that there was a hidden truth in Daniel's words. On the other hand, there was his life as he knew it, populated by people like Mia and Tom, who represented normalcy and stability. They were his present, the people who cared for him and had been part of his everyday existence. Trusting them meant maintaining his grasp on the life he had built, a life grounded in reality away from shadowy conspiracies. This decision, fraught with the potential to alter his path profoundly, weighed heavily on him. Should he step into the abyss of Daniel's world, driven by the fear of unseen forces and the loyalty to an old friend? Or should he hold on to the tangible, familiar bonds of his current life, choosing to see Daniel's theories as mere illusions born from illness? Wyatt realized that his choice would not only define his reality, but also reflect his values, whether to give precedence to old loyalties and uncharted possibilities, or to the concrete relationships and sanity of his existing world. Each option tugged at him, encapsulating a battle between the past and the present, between fear and reason. With his mind teetering on the brink of decision, Wyatt knew that confronting Mia and Tom would either anchor him back to reality or sever the last ties he had to a normal life. It felt like walking a tightrope across an abyss, where every step could be his undoing. He arranged to meet both in their favorite cafe, a place that had witnessed many of their shared laughs and confidences, now a backdrop to a scenario fraught with tension. As they gathered, the usual casual greetings felt heavy, loaded with the weight of Wyatt's impending revelations. Sitting across from them, Wyatt's hands trembled slightly, betraying the turmoil inside. He took a deep breath, the air filled with the scent of coffee and pastries, a stark contrast to the gravity of his thoughts. "Something has been bothering me," Wyatt began, his voice steadier than he felt. "And I fear it might change how you see me or even how I view the world." He paused, searching their faces for any sign of the oddities he'd been led to believe were there. "I've been receiving calls, disturbing ones, claiming that people around me might not be who they appear." Mia's expression shifted to one of concern, while Tom's brow furrowed in confusion. Wyatt plunged ahead, laying out his interactions with Daniel, the cryptic warnings, and the consuming paranoia that had driven him to the edge. As he spoke, the reality of his accusations hung between them like a thick fog, challenging the trust and history they had built together. This confrontation was Wyatt's crucible, testing the foundations of his relationships and his own mental resilience. The reactions from Mia and Tom would either confirm his fears or reassure him of his misjudgments, but laying bare his suspicions was the only way Wyatt could hope to find closure or a path back to sanity. The cafe fell into a tense silence as Wyatt finished laying out his tangled web of fears and suspicions to Mia and Tom. The air was thick with a mix of disbelief and concern as they processed the depth of Wyatt's turmoil. Mia reached across the table, her hand attempting to bridge the physical and emotional distance that had suddenly sprung up between them. Tom leaned back, his face a mask of contemplation, clearly struggling to align this version of Wyatt with the friend he knew. "You're talking about conspiracies, Wyatt. But have you considered this might be your anxiety manifesting? Maybe it's pushing you to find dangers where there are none." Mia's voice was gentle, her concern palpable. Tom nodded in agreement, adding, "We're your friends, man. We've been through so much together. It doesn't make sense to throw all that away on some phantom menace." Their responses, filled with reason and worry, began to pierce the veil of paranoia that had clouded Wyatt's mind. He looked at them, really looked, seeing the genuine worry in their eyes, the earnest confusion. It dawned on him then the role that human psychology and paranoia could play in distorting reality. His mind, once his most trusted asset, had turned into a labyrinth of fear, each thought a thread leading deeper into darkness. This climax, unfolding amid the quiet buzz of the cafe, was less about startling revelations or dramatic confrontations, and more about the internal battle within Wyatt. It underscored the fragility of the human mind, how easily trust could be undermined by fear, and how paranoia could sever the most steadfast connections. As the discussion continued, Wyatt began to see the outlines of his own psychological traps, the realization washing over him with both relief and a deep lingering sadness. The journey back to trust and mental clarity would be long, but it began with recognizing the illusions his mind had constructed. In the weeks following his confrontation with Mia and Tom, Wyatt embarked on a quiet journey of introspection and healing. The conversation in the cafe had been a pivotal moment, a turning point where the lines between reality and delusion became clear. Recognizing the impact of his paranoia was the first step toward recovery, and it prompted him to seek professional help to address his underlying anxiety and the psychological strains that had propelled him into a vortex of suspicion. As therapy sessions became a part of his routine, Wyatt gradually learned to untangle the complex web of his thoughts, distinguishing between genuine intuition and misguided fears. He worked on rebuilding the trust that had frayed with his loved ones, approaching each interaction with a newfound awareness of the biases that had once clouded his judgment. Mia and Tom, though initially shaken, stood by him throughout this process, their support unwavering. Their relationships, once threatened by the shadows of doubt, began to mend, strengthened by open communication and a deeper understanding of the challenges Wyatt had faced. The aftermath of Wyatt's decisions also led him to reflect on the broader implications of his experience. He started journaling, documenting his thoughts and feelings as a way to process and give structure to his journey. These reflections not only helped him make sense of his own mind, but also turned into a blog that he hoped might help others feeling isolated by similar struggles. Through these reflective practices, Wyatt not only worked to reclaim his life, but also contributed to a larger dialogue about mental health, paranoia, and the importance of community and understanding in navigating the complexities of human psychology. This period of reflection and growth transformed what had been one of his life's darkest chapters into a pathway leading to greater empathy and resilience. In the aftermath of revealing his deep-seated fears and suspicions, Wyatt faced a period of re-evaluation. His openness about his struggles became a crucial turning point. Whether each day brought him clarity or left him feeling isolated depended largely on his own actions and reactions. He chose to embrace clarity, recognizing that his suspicions had almost cost him his most valued relationships. To mitigate the possibility of further isolation, Wyatt actively engaged in therapy sessions, focusing on cognitive behavioral techniques that helped him challenge and reframe his paranoid thoughts. He also resumed his old hobbies, like photography and cycling, which connected him with communities that shared his interests. These activities grounded him, reminding him of his identity beyond his anxieties. Wyatt also took deliberate steps to mend and fortify his relationships. With Mia and Tom, he established weekly meetups where they could talk openly about anything, ensuring that no unspoken tensions could fester. These gatherings soon became something Wyatt looked forward to, symbolizing his progress in the enduring bond they shared. Moreover, Wyatt began volunteering at a mental health awareness organization. Here, he found a sense of purpose in helping others understand and navigate their psychological challenges. This role provided him not just with structure, but with a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, including his own. Each of these actions showed Wyatt's commitment to dealing with the consequences of his earlier paranoia. He was no longer a passive observer of his life spiraling out of control, but an active participant in crafting a path toward greater understanding and connection. Through these efforts, Wyatt discovered that clarity did not just happen, it was built through continuous effort and the support of a community that cared. As Wyatt's story draws to a close, the narrative leaves us hovering in a space of thoughtful ambiguity, reflecting on the nuanced themes of trust and reality. Through his journey, Wyatt has ventured deep into the complexities of human perception, discovering how easily reality can be colored by the lenses of fear and doubt. The conclusion of his story does not offer a neat resolution, but rather poses lingering questions to the reader. What is the true nature of trust? How much of our perceived reality is shaped by our fears and the unseen influences of others? Wyatt, having navigated the treacherous waters of paranoia, finds himself more attuned to these questions than ever before. He stands now on a precipice, looking out over a landscape that is both familiar and irrevocably altered. His relationships, though mended, carry the subtle scars of past suspicions, serving as reminders of the fragility of trust. Yet, there is a newfound strength in his awareness, a readiness to confront these challenges with a clearer perspective. The story leaves Wyatt in a reflective state, contemplating the real versus the perceived, the seen versus the unseen. His path forward is not defined by absolute answers, but by his